All right, beautiful people. Today we talk about your drafts and trends I'm seeing across them, as well as how to fix comma splices, fragments, and run-ons. Let's get going. Sharing screen here. And no, we will not be talking about the blueprint for greening affordable housing, though that is such a wonderful thing. We are going to talk about greening these essays. A Neil of Inequality shout out to Noah. Thank you in advance and with great admiration for your work. Here to coach, not to write. Thank you so much for your writing, and I hope to coach to the best of my ability. Here, let's go. With the current state of Black Lives Matter movement following George Floyd's death, athletes and influencers have spoken out on how they feel about racial discrimination in the United States. The issues being highly discussed now are precisely the same issues Colin Kaepernick was protesting several years ago. The key difference between now and then is that Kaepernick was shunned for protesting in 2016, and now it seems socially acceptable for athletes to discuss these biases. The perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions have changed due to the most recent movements within the Black Lives Matter protests in a reaction to George Floyd's death. This begs the question of how our society has changed and how other professional athletes and influencers in society today view Colin Kaepernick's past actions. In a preseason game in 2016, Colin Kaepernick decided to kneel during the national anthem in order to call attention toward racial injustice in the United States. This protest was taken very harshly by the media and fans alike. Professional athletes engaging in social protests have been categorized as disrespectful or unpatriotic by some fans, and while others applaud them for using their names and platforms to bring publicity to important issues. While others applaud them. The heart of the debate, however, has centered around patriotic symbolism and the sentiment that all Americans should stand during the national anthem to honor the men and women of armed forces. Not only were people disturbed by the fact that he was kneeling for a symbol that represented what the armed forces do for us, but fans were also enraged at the fact that an athlete protested during a sporting event. Some people think that an athlete shouldn't present their opposition to the flag during their job. And the next sentence only, although there were many haters of Kaepernick's protest, the purpose of it was deeply rooted in American history and seemed more criticized than taken seriously. Okay, a few things. First of all, what works here? What works is a clear delineation that then is not now. Kaepernick's protests were not heard, and he was shunned in 2016, and now his protests seem to align and his concerns align with what is being protested in the Black Lives Matter protests. So that is clear, and we can see this. Let's chart it quickly together. So we see the current moment is what is highlighted here, right? So the current state of Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, and we have clearly the subjects or the folks that we're going to discuss, the athletes and influencers have spoken out. We expect now the essay to deal with that. The issues being discussed are precisely the same issues Colin Kaepernick was protesting several years ago. Are many of the same issues. I don't know if they're precisely the same issues, but they might be. And I think this is where we can allow for a little slip, meaning the spirit of the point is there, even if it's not absolutely, positively truth, signed, sealed, delivered, absolutely airtight. A key difference between now and then is Kaepernick was shunned. Now it seems socially acceptable. So a nice juxtaposition, or what we call a binary, a positioning of two ideas of slight opposition, right? It's a difference and nicely stated. So we're defining and differentiating. A good key thing to do really from the onset of the essay, if we can. The perception has changed. Let's look at this sentence and talk about how we can possibly de-chunk it a little bit. It's got a lot of prepositions. So let's look at this. The perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions have changed due to the most recent movements within the Black Lives Matter protests in a reaction to George Floyd's death. So what might help in this case is that we look at what is the main action we want to push, the subject that really is the pop point. And sometimes reversing the clauses can help us. So one way to rewrite the sentence to make it a little bit more workable is to start with in reaction. In reaction to George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matters protests, in reaction to George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter protests have brought much awareness to the issues Colin Kaepernick was protesting. This in turn seems to correlate to a new perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions. So what I did there is we simply dechunked by going to 2 sentences. The other option is to keep with the flow because the subject matter has been Kaepernick was protesting, Kaepernick was shunned, and now the perception of him has changed. And the logical flow of sentence or construct of idea to idea is good. You always want to pull on what you were talking about in the previous sentence into the next sentence. In this case, Kaepernick is the key point, and now we're kind of shifting to the perception of him. So keeping with that, we could still dechunk to 2 sentences, right? Key difference between now and then is Kaepernick was shunned, and now it seems socially acceptable to discuss these biases. The perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions have changed, period. Why, question mark? Perhaps because the most recent movements within the Black Lives Matter protests have spurned a new way to view issues dealing with race. And notice I dropped this one clause here because I didn't know how to tuck it in the moment, being spontaneous here in rewriting or rethinking that sentence. But we could still get it in, right? So the perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions have changed, period. In reaction to George Floyd's death, many now see Black Lives Matter protests as legitimate, period. This begs the question of how our society has changed. Again, we have a little bit of juggle going on in this particular paragraph. And what we can see, and I think we can see across many of your drafts, is a struggle to define exactly what is the core point I want to say and what are the subpoints, what comes under and what is alongside and what is over. Meaning what's the umbrella concept, the overall idea or theme, and what are sub-themes or sub-points. In this case, I think we've got clearly how has Colin Kaepernick and his style of protest now been received? How has what he is saying now being seen as legitimate? The means of that legitimacy or the means of why that is so seems to be indicated as this new sense through Black Lives protests in reaction to George Floyd, B, how athletes are now discussing it and influencers, all right? So those are 2 process points. Those are 2 means, if you will, of how this perception is shifted. And delineating, if you will, the means from the actual conclusion, you know, the conclusion here being the perception has changed, is important. And that is going to be helpful for some of you to think through. Okay, what are the means? What are the action points, right, that are being pursued to get us to that theme or that conclusion, that thesis statement, if you will, and recognize them as subservient, as if you will, underneath that umbrella idea. So really the essay is about the perception of Colin Kaepernick's actions, I believe. And again, this is where I have to be coaching alongside. This is a conversation with Noah, not a dictating to him, but I believe based on having talked with him and looked at a few of the other paragraphs. All right, so here we go with that. And now we go, if you will, we're backpedaling into a little bit of history. You could break into a new paragraph when you shift into this and just have a fairly strong topic sentence that indicates why you're doing this. Or you could just break and not really explain, it's implicit, right? So We have the idea perception has changed. This begs the question of how our society has changed. Now, we might even end the sentence with that, boom, right? Or we could just continue because it is legit, even the way it's written, how society has changed and how other professional athletes and influencers in society today view Colin Kaepernick's past actions, period. We might go to a new paragraph, we might not. What do we gain by going to a new paragraph? We gain a little bit of energy, we gain a little bit of a flag going up the pole or a little bit of an arrow, like a person directing traffic on the road. So what I mean by that, the policeman says, go here, right? He's pointing. And in this sense, whenever you break a paragraph, you're putting up a little visual alert. It's a way of saying the policeman's pointing at this. You're trying to accentuate a point. It's used very much, of course, in feature writing and news writing to keep people engaged, because it is a technique. If you look at novels and you look at feature writing, you look at news articles, there's tons of small paragraphs, right? Even one-line paragraphs, because they're used visually. We all work visually and we all want to kind of engage visually. And so that becomes a way to make sure we stay with the matter at hand. In academic work, it's almost considered a little poo-poo, meaning a classical viewpoint of writing going back into the 1700s is to have one idea really stretch, almost like a accordion, right? It has all the thematics, but it still all relates. So because we have now Kaepernick's actions, we have the perception of him, how it's shifted, and we're going to kind of weave in just for a moment, sort of backpedal in the same paragraph to what happened, but then quickly shift back to how it was taken on, if you will, and then how to reframe it in light of the thesis as we see it wraps up whether or not an athlete should be perceived as oppositional if they do bring up politics or not. And that's really the heart of the thesis. So in some ways, you see the thematic of these things roughly relating. We also think of an introduction being pretty beefy, if you will, lay down quite a few cards of subpoints as well as major theme, and trying to engage you as reader to say this is important. All right, so is this person doing the basic checkpoints of an introduction? Yes, they're identifying the topic. You know, they're identifying key players that we think are going to follow. Athletes and influencers are going to be a key data point and analytic of how perhaps this perception has changed. What is not clear in the paragraph is that we haven't really ordered, if you will, the deck. I don't know what the lead card is. I mean, you got the player in the hands with all those cards sitting here. But I want you to flip the cards and say, point to this one as your key card. I got the Joker right here. Okay, so the Joker, if you will, is the equivalent to the theme. The umbrella term is my other little metaphor here. You guys hanging in where? The point is the perception of Colin Kaepernick has shifted. That's your point, right? That's your umbrella. Why is it shifted? Athletes and influencers are having a say. And why? Because they had Twitter and social media has even more game than perhaps 2016. Secondly, Black Lives Matter protests are happening at the same time. Thirdly, there's multiple deaths, and this is gone cray-cray. Perhaps just the volume of it as possibly one of the data points that Noah might explore. I don't know. But being clear about stacking the deck, and when you reveal the hand, flipping it and saying, here's the Joker, and here's, if you will, my set of cards, and I'm seeing these three I'm going to play, if you will, in this pattern. Doing a little bit of that, you know, not giving away the whole house. I mean, the metaphor is not perfect, guys, because obviously you don't want to play all your hand of cards too explicitly in front of your reader, otherwise they're going to be bored in the rest of the work. Flip side is academia loves explanation. They love clarity. They love definition. They love all the cards out in front. That's the truth, folks. It's, you know, first I will do this, second I will do this, third I will do this. I'm going to tell you, folks, if you are writing a science-based paper or one of inquiry that's along the lines of informing people, do it. It's just the right way to write, because it's about information, it's about transfer, it's about your reader being able to harvest the information quickly, didactically, linearly, without any confusion. Do it. So first, second, third. First I will do this, second I will do this, third, the outline, if you will, in the introduction, either first or second paragraph. Smart idea. You can never go wrong with that in general, folks. It's just like, it's like management 101. It's like writing a memo, directing traffic for those that you're managing. What are we doing? And use literally even almost using numbers sometimes, or using keywords like first, second, third, or another, or a third position I will explore, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, we've got a good idea of the perception is the main idea. The athletes and influencers are a sub point. The Black Lives Matters protest, perhaps you're putting in the mix as a differentiator as to why things are, the perception of Colin is different. I do think we start to muddy waters a little bit here in the introduction in a preseason game. We go back to history, which, you know, feels right, but I think we might break to another paragraph, might, because where we end up going is kind of defining the term a little bit more. What do we mean by the perception of him, and what about him was really the problem? So maybe we just cap with a bit of a topic sentence. Um, the key in understanding the shift in perception is that we need to define key terms of kneeling, national anthem, and patriotic symbolism, or just the phrase patriotic symbolism, and then and, uh, and then explain. This all began in a preseason game in 2016. Colin Kaepernick decided to kneel during the national anthem. Da-da-da-da. The protest was taken harshly by media. Okay, it's the who, what, where, and why. It gives us the background. Who is this guy? What's going on? Great. And then we do usually, folks, need a lead into quotes. It's a 90% rule. I can let Noah get away with this in the introduction. And sometimes it can work. We just run right into the money, right? We want to run into the idea of the person, but 90% of the time it's good to frame it with a lead phrase. You know, according to Josh McNeil, ESPN commentator, comma, professional athletes engaging in social protests have been categorized as blah, 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 blah. Okay. Let's not miss what this paragraph, this second part of the paragraph is trying to do. It's trying to define the history so we know the who, what, where, and why, but then it's trying to define some other key terms as to why Colin Kaepernick's perception has shifted. And why has it shifted? Because perhaps we're redefining terms like disrespectful, patriotism, the flag, and kneeling. And I think that is the heart of the essay. That is, if you will, the second half of the thesis statement. Colin Kaepernick's perception has shifted in media because athletes and influencers have stepped up, Black Lives Matters protests have stepped up, and our perception of key terms of patriotic symbolism have shifted. That's really your trifecta support for your thesis that's going on here, I think, Noah. Making that bullet clear is probably to your advantage, even in this area. Is this badly written as is? No. It could just be gamed up or clarified slightly more if we want to go for explicitness, which generally is a good idea for academia and academic writing. All right. I think there's a certain amount of flow here that's already implicit that's pretty cool. In other words, there's not really a hard thesis style going on in this essay here. And in some ways, I wouldn't want to take that away from you, Noah. So you're going to hear me say both things out of my mouth here, right? I might stack a little bit more clearly those variables, like I said. Your umbrella term is the perception. Your change agents are the reason things possibly that you can hint as to the reason Colin's perception has changed are athletes and influencers stepping up in a certain way, us reinterpreting patriotic symbolism, and possibly just through the volume and sort of the moment of Black Lives Matters with all these deaths and many people showing up together. I think perhaps those naysayers have to look around them and say, oop, the tide is going out. Maybe I need to join. So could be some of that going on. All right. I'm going to do one more thing. You guys are already well beyond the pale with me. You're like, I think I need to take a pause, Dr. Stavenhagen. This is okay lecture, but you know, yep, I think brevity is a solo whip. We're going to end in 2 minutes. All right. Although there were many haters of Kaepernick's protest, the purpose of it was clearly rooted in American history and seemed more criticized than taken seriously. Following the first game, he kneeled. He said, I'm not going to stand to show up pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people of color. He went on to say, you know, I will continue to stand for people that are oppressed until it changes. I feel the flag, until I feel what the flag represents, that it's going to represent all people. I'm going to stand, I'll continue to stand. And here comes the paraphrase, which is so critical, folks. If you introduce a quote, pull on the quote, pull on the content of the quote, paraphrase it, and then analyze or interpret it, comment upon it. All right, it's clear from what Kaepernick is saying. Maybe please tell us what he's saying in your own words first, that he will not stop protesting no matter what fans or media think of him, and also is willing to risk his job to send a message. This institutionalized racism is deeply rooted in our society as well as the NFL. He went against the social values of the NFL. He lost his job. So we're doing sort of historical stands here. What did he say? What happened, right? He was a top 10 quarterback. This shows in the NFL, 70% of players African American. Still, white supremacy, institutionalized racism exists. Attendance viewership went down. The league in 2016 clearly prioritized income and fans over players and rights. And this shows a clear connection between the league and systemic racism still exists. All right, two things. You're going to notice the conclusion sentence and the topic sentence, and I'm going on in a minute. I said I got to get out of here. This one is flawed in the sense that this doesn't really represent what the whole paragraph's about. I highly recommend going back through your material and saying, hey, is this what this paragraph's about? Really, really work hard for your topic sentences. Take time to say to yourself, what am I really saying? This whole paragraph really is the background of what the flag represents and that what his protest is about. So he's defining the protest. That's really what this paragraph is about. It's defining the protest and defining how and why he got fired. That's the two moves that's going on here. So that's really what the topic sentence needs to do. So what did he protest and why did he get fired? That's really what it's about. Now, the end where you're pulling on implications, you got to be careful here too. I think you can hint at it. Certainly economics seem to be a play. Certainly a little bit of at least a deaf ear toward these protests seem to be at play. So surely the prioritization seemed to be there, right, toward income, right? Fans did not show up as much, or at least quite a few of them. So I think we can say it's always good to couch things in probability, also because it's early in the essay. You've got time to develop this a little further later. So here's what we want to do. We say the league clearly prioritized, seem to have prioritized. Likely prioritized. I don't know about clearly. I'm not sure yet because I don't have enough data. You didn't give me a ton. And so that's what the problem is with here. I got a slight pushback on that, just slight, because I think it's there, but I don't think there's enough data for me to say all the way over the top. Clear connection between league and systemic racism. I don't think it's absolutely bullet. We don't have enough evidence yet. This hints at the league's participation in systemic racism. And you can then pull the next paragraph further. Now you can kind of prove further. Okay, good guys. I think we're done for now with this part of the lecture, and I will get back to y'all on one more here in a second.